purpose of this lesson is to learn about ranges, how cells and ranges are related, how to select a range, named ranges, range shortcuts, how to reference a range in another workbook or worksheet, and also about offsets. A range is a type of object. It can be referenced as an object. We can stick to our noun.verb structure. A range can be a single cell or it could be a range of cells. So it could be just the cell A1 or it could be the cell A1 through D5 and all of the cells in between. A range in Excel is a rectangular shaped area that contains one or more cells. The following are equivalent statements. I could say something like range of just the cell E3. I could specify a specific worksheet, number 1, and then range E3. I could say cells 5, 3, and if you think about E is the 5th letter in the alphabet, and then 3 down, so it's the equivalent value for cells. We'll get more into why we do it this way later. We could reference a range as an offset, so I could be A1 and then offset, which means go to the right 4 and down 2, and that would also give me the same place. Or I could reference a range by a name. Now in this case we'd be assuming that the range has already been named. A range can be specified a couple of different ways. We could specify a range as the first cell colon and then the ending cell, and it would specify a range of all of the cells in between. We could specify the range as A1, B5 separated as 2 separate values. Now this one actually has a little bit of a benefit because if I'm using A1 and B5 and I have those specified in a variable somewhere, then this formula or this version actually works better with formulas in Excel. We could specify A1 as our beginning point and then wherever the user clicks, and so the active cell, when it becomes selected, that's where we would actually have our ending. Or we could allow the user to select the first cell and then do an offset to tell it that wherever they click, we're going to go 5 cells over and 2 down from there, and we're going to select it. So we have different ways that we can actually reference the entire range. Excel does allow you to use what's called a named range, and a named range just simply means that you select an area and then you type a name up here for it. And then what happens is we have this thing called the Name Manager. It exists under the Formulas tab, and the Name Manager will show you all of the named ranges, and then it will also tell you what it specifies to. So in this case, it is sheet 1, and it starts at C5 and goes through C10. Now we can specify ranges, we can have multiple ranges, and the same range could actually have different names. I have a blank workbook, and I would like to create a named range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight something, and notice up here it just simply says E4, but in reality it goes from E4 all the way down to K15. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this named range. And usually we would want to give it something more descriptive. What's the reason for this range, and that's what we would actually name it. But in this case, I just want to show you how it works. So what I can do is I can come up here to the Formula tab and go to Name Manager, and you'll see that I have a named range, and it goes from E4 to K15. All right, so what I can do is I can reference that later. So if I have a range, I could do something like equals, and then named range actually shows up on my list, so I could use that for future formulas. There are some shortcuts that we can use to reference these ranges. So before I said about range and then a specific cell, we can simply reference that by putting the square brackets and then the cell location and then close the square brackets. We can actually have a range of more than one cell, and all we do is in the square brackets we specify the beginning, colon, and then the end. We could have multiple ranges, so instead of just having one range of cells, if I have multiple ranges that we want to select, then we simply put the beginning and the end of the first range, comma, beginning and end of the second range. Or if we have a named range, we can just put it in square brackets and reference it just by its name. Sometimes we will have to reference a range that's in another workbook or another worksheet. All right, so if I'm in the same workbook and I need to reference a range that's in the same workbook but on a different worksheet, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say worksheets. Notice it's plural. and then the name of the sheet goes inside the parentheses and inside of quotes, dot, and then the range that you want to select within that worksheet. If we're trying to select a range in a different workbook, so we're going to select a range that's in a different worksheet, in a different workbook, then we have to add workbooks to the beginning. So we say workbooks, in quotes, we specify the name of the file, and if it's in a different folder, we'd have to specify the full path to get to it. And then worksheets, just like we did before, the name of the worksheet, and then the range. Now in this case, I want to select a range beginning at A1, and I also want to select through B2. So what happens is this acts a little funny, but we have to specify range, and then in parentheses, we have to specify range A1. Now I could, instead of saying range A1, I could just simply put my square bracket A1 close square bracket B2 close square bracket. But be aware that when we specify a range like this, we're specifying a range in another workbook, and then we have to specify the range that's in that workbook. So the word range actually is going to be specified twice. Instead of specifying a range, we could specify cells. Now this is going to be used to reference the cells by their location. And the reason that we do this is it's actually easier when we start using variables. All right, so the way that it works is we say cells.item, and then the item that we want is going to be in parentheses, so we specify the row, comma, column. Now what we're going to do is we're going to specify something like cells.item 3, comma, D. Now notice this is backwards, so if I want D3, I'm specifying 3 first, then the D. Now D is the fourth letter in the alphabet, it's the fourth column, so if I want to reference this by number, I can do that too. So I can specify 3, comma, 4, and this would actually give me the same location. Now the reason that this is significant is because now what I can do is I could reference this as a variable and reference this by a variable, and whatever the variable value is, if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever, it would automatically know which column to go to. Now the word item can be left off. It is a keyword that is understood. So instead of saying cells.item 3, comma, 4, we could just simply say cells 3, comma, 4. An offset is used to specify the location of a range relative to the current range. So if I have a cell selected right now, I can specify another row and another column in relation to whatever's selected right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to do range.offset, and then we're going to offset it by a certain number of rows and a certain number of columns. So in this case, if I have A1 selected, then what I can do is I can go the offset and go down 4 rows. Now this could be a positive or a negative number. So positive would move down, negative would move up. And then the column, same thing, a positive number moves to the right, a negative number would move to the left. So in this case, my range that's selected is A1, and I want to go down 4 rows and go to the right 5 columns, therefore it would select E6. Now I can shorten this a little bit. You'll notice here we say row offset and it's colon equals. It's a little odd to type it like this, but that's how we actually specify it. So instead of saying row set colon equals 4, we could just simply say 4. And so if I do offset 4, comma, 5, that's equivalent to the one up here. We can also resize a particular range. So if I have a range selected right now, and maybe I want to add another row or a couple more columns or something like that, instead of reselecting all of the cells that are within that range, I can simply resize it. Now what that means is that it would add some more columns and it would add some more rows. So what we do to specify this is we specify the range. So where do we start? We start at A1. We want to resize it by so many rows. So we say row size, and once again it's colon equals and the number of rows. And then the column size colon equals and the number of columns. So if I start at A1, I just have A1 selected, and I resize it, if I add 4 rows and 3 columns, then what will happen is we will end up from A1 to D5 being selected. Now we can also use the shortcut again, and we can say we want to resize it 4, comma, 3, and that would be the equivalent shortcut to specifying the row size and the column size up here. sometimes we're going to need to determine whether or not a cell or a range is empty. We're going to use this for making decisions later. So let's say I want to know if A1 is empty before I try to write something to it. Or I want to know if the range from A1 to B3 is empty. Then what we can do is we can use this IsEmpty command and tell it either the cell or the entire range that we want to select. And what we're going to do is we're going to start using this. We're going to say something like, if it's empty, then we can write something to it. Or if it is not empty, because we can also do not functions, if it's not empty, then maybe there's a number there and we need to see if it's a number or if it's something else, and we can start doing things like scrubbing data or working with formulas. There are two ways that we can combine data from multiple worksheets. We have what's called a union and also an intersection. Now, a union is going to be where I have two worksheets that have identical columns. They both have the exact same column headers, and they have the same type of data in the columns. If I have two tables that are in that type of format, where everything is identical, all the columns are the same, they have the same type of data in each of the columns, they're what's called union ready. And what that means is that if you think about it from the perspective of the user, I could highlight all of the rows and columns that are in that table, except for the heading column, the heading row. I could select all of the other cells, cut it from one worksheet, and paste it directly at the bottom of the other worksheet. And so what a union would do is it would take all the data from one worksheet and then put all the data from another worksheet at the bottom of the first worksheet. Conversely, we also have what's called an intersection. Now, an intersection is going to be used to combine data from two worksheets again, but instead of putting all the data at the bottom and just simply adding more stuff at the bottom of a worksheet, this would be used more for where we need to put relational data beside other data. So let's say I have a table that has a list of parts that we have for sale. And then I have another another worksheet that has a list of all of the sales that we've made. And instead of having the description, our second table just simply has a part number and the number that were sold and the date. Well, if I want to have a worksheet that has the name of the item and how many we sold, I can't just simply do it from one of those two worksheets. So what I have to do is I have to somehow put the data together. This would be similar to what we would do in a database. In a database, what we would do is we would specify that we're trying to take stuff out of one table and stuff out of another table and put them together through what's called a join. And we just simply use some sort of relational conditional statement to be able to put that data together. We can do the exact same thing in Excel with an intersection between two worksheets. Now, for this to work, the data in one worksheet has to have a column that is related to a column that exists in the other worksheet. We also have other types of data regions that we can use. These are going to be areas on a report that contain data from a data source. So I may have a workbook that has data in it for our sales over the last couple of months. And what we can do is we can generate a chart, which a chart gets rendered as a picture. So we can't manipulate the chart as a chart itself. We can only manipulate it as a picture. But we also do have lists and tables. Now, what happens with a list is it's going to show all of the raw data that exists in a particular worksheet. And we can manipulate that data, just like we do any of the data in an Excel worksheet. We also do have tables. Now, these are going to be a special collection that's broken into rows and columns. Well, it happens to look and act and feel just like an Excel spreadsheet. So therefore, we can manipulate tables just like we manipulate our spreadsheets. The last one that we have are what are called matrices, and these are going to be rendered as formatted cells. Now, this is going to be similar to HTML. What happens is if I put something into a matrix, instead of having a list of rows and columns that have formulas in them that automatically update when numbers change, a matrix is going to be a snapshot of the way that something is at this point in time. What that means is that when we look at values in a matrix, we will not be able to update the values by simply changing a number and letting the system auto recompute it. It can't do that because it's just strictly the literal value. So when the system rendered the calculation and it got an answer, then it replaced the formula with the literal value, and we cannot manipulate that data. I have a new Excel workbook, and I opened up the VBA and I created a new subroutine called range lesson, and I want to show you how we would actually select these ranges. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a range, and my range is going to be something. And notice that when I start typing, it pops up with the tooltip here and it tells me what it's looking for. Now I can tell it cell 1 and cell 2, and then it's going to select it as a range. So I want to select D3. So I do dot. And you'll notice I have activate here is available, but I also have select. Now the difference between activate and select is that I could select many different cells at the same time, but only one of those cells could be activated. So I'll show you that difference here in just a minute. All right, so I want to select this, and if you watch, it will automatically move the selection down to D3. So I'm going to run this. There we go. All right, so now what I could also do is instead of range D3 here, I could do something like E5. And then when I run this, my selection moves again. So I can either specify range or I could just specify the shortcut. All right, so I could do a range, and my range here could be a contiguous range. So I could do something like A1 through E5. And then we're going to select that. And all of this is now selected. I could also do something like A1 to E5, and then I also want to select another range. Now this is not going to work quite the way that you expect it to, but I'm going to select G7 to I26. Okay, now what you would expect to happen would be that it would select this area, and then it would also select this area, so over here it would have two selections. But when you run this, what it's actually going to do is it's going to select all of the cells that contain these two ranges. So it's going to be basically the same as saying A1 through I26. So if I actually were to go like this, that would be the same selection. So what we're doing is we're just simply saying that I want to select that area. Okay, now that area is selected, but I want to do an activation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the range of, say, like F9. And this time I want to activate it. Okay, so we select this whole range, but you notice right now that A1 is the one that is white. That's the one that's actually activated. So if I started typing, that's where it would type. Okay, but now what I'm doing is I tell it I want it to select that whole range, but then activate F9. You'll notice that F9 is now the one that's activated. Now, we can play with variables in here just like we do in other programming languages. So the way that we create a new variable in Visual Basic is I have to dimension it. So I'm going to dimension a variable called myColumn, and I have to specify what it is. It's going to be as a new integer. And I'm going to make another variable called myRow as an integer. So I'm specifying it as data type. Now there are other data types. We also do have doubles and floats, and we also have one called variant, which simply means that we're going to let the system pick what the data type is the first time that it's run. But for right now, I'm just going to leave these as integers. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that I want to specify that my call is equal to 3 and my row is equal to 5. Now, what I would kind of expect to happen here is if I type in range, and if I were to do something like this, I would hope that it would work. So let's do like my call, comma, my row. Well, the problem is this actually will not run. If I try to run this, I'm going to end up with an error. Okay, so the reason for this is that my range cannot accept variables like this because it's expecting something along the lines of a letter and a number. All right, so for me to be able to do this, I instead have to use our cells. Okay, so I'm going to do cells.item, and then if I leave this as my column and my row, actually, let me show you how this works. If I open this up, it wants a row first, and then it wants the column first. I'm going to do my row, comma, my column, and then dot select. Now notice it did not automatically pop up for the selection there. but that actually is the correct syntax for it. So what we're doing is we're telling it that we want it to substitute in 5, and we want it to substitute in 3 here, and then select it. And there we go. So what we did is we went 3 columns over, 5 rows down. So 3 columns over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows down. And now we've actually selected that cell. Now we can also leave off item. So I could do something like this. And then that does the exact same thing. The next thing I'm going to play with is the offset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just delete all of this. And what I want to do is I want to take whatever the active cell is, which is the one that's selected over here, and I want to do an offset from there. So I'm going to say active cell dot offset, and then how much of an offset do I want? Notice it pops up and it says row offset, comma, column offset. All right, so I want to go down 4 rows, and I want to go to the right 2 rows. And then I want to select it. Let's go and run this, and you watch, it'll go down 4 and over 2. And there's our new selection. Now we could do something like -4 and -2. Run it, and it goes back up. So our negatives will go either left or up. And then our negatives will go, our positives will go down or right. So what they're going to do is we can specify from our current location, do we want to go left or right? All right, so now the thing is like here, we're going to go up 4 rows over 2, run that. If I run it again, we actually end up with an error because we've gone off of the page. So we actually can't go beyond one of the bounds of the page itself. The next thing that I want to play with is actually going to be the resize command. So I'm going to go ahead and delete out the code that's here. And I want to select a range, and then I want to expand our range. So I'm going to make a range. I'm going to call it range of, let's say, from B2 to D3. Just give it a range. And then dot select. And let's go ahead and run this. So there's our selection, and I want to increase the size of that. I want to resize our range. Now our selection right now is 3 columns wide and has 2 columns tall. So it's not that I want to increase the size of this by so many columns, it's that I want to increase it so that the size of my selection is such a size. All right, so what I want to do is instead of selecting this, I'm going to resize it. So you'll see resize, and then when I open this up, it wants to know our row size and our column size. So let's say I want it to be 6 columns wide and 5 columns tall. So I'm going to do 5, 6, and then I'm going to do dot select. And then what you'll notice is that it's not going to add 5 more rows. It's just that it's going to make it so that it's 5 rows tall and 6 columns wide. So that's our new size by using a resize. Now we can leave these numbers off of here if we want to, so like the 5, if I were to leave this 5 out of here, what it will do is it will leave the original row size of this selection, but increase the width to 6. Or if I were to leave the 5 here and not put a 6 in here, then it will leave the original width, but increase the row height to 5. So depending on what we leave inside of here will dictate how it actually acts, and if it's going to increase the size by a certain number of columns or a certain number of rows. In this lesson, you learned about ranges and how we use them to perform selections and activate cells. You learned how cells and ranges are related, and that we can use cells to actually reference the column and rows by using variables instead of by a specific letter and number combination. You learned how to select and activate a range. You learned about named ranges and how we can use those in formulas. You learned some of the range shortcuts by using the square brackets. You learned about referencing a range in another workbook or a worksheet, and also about how to use offsets.